Are you happy with how much they're diversifying their revenue here? They seem to beat on the wearables and the home devices and whatnot, but is it enough to say that Apple is not just relying on this iPhone over here?
Well, the iPhone did incredibly well, and we saw that in our supply chain data, so that was something that we were expecting, but I think the street wasn't expecting. And we're going into a 5G sort of mega cycle over the next 2 years, so that's going to be a big driver for iPhone sales. So I'm not worried about that for the next couple of years, really. But the services part of the business, I would have liked it to be a little bit more, because that's really where the long-term annuity-type high-margin revenues are going to come from. And I think that's going to be great.
Taylor Riggs, you're out there in San Francisco. Obviously, you cover Apple and these tech companies pretty heavily. What caught your eye the most out of this report?
I think I'd have to agree. It all comes down to the iPhone. As much as this company wants to try to tell you they're a services company, only 20% of their revenue comes from services, 52% of their revenue comes from the iPhone, and 10% of their revenue comes from wearables and accessories that are dependent on the iPhone. So I think coming in with strong iPhone revenue, we were looking, as long as it didn't totally tank last quarter, analysts were going to be happy. And I think the story is going to be a second half of 2020 story with that iPhone revenue. Eric mentioned that we're in the middle of a 5G sort of super cycle upgrade. That's according to Dan Ives over at Wedbush, with a $400 price target. So if you get that iPhone upgrade, you get a shorter replacement cycle, and you really start to see that story fold into the second half of 2020. I think iPhone revenue coming in really strong is a very good story.
Absolutely, and that's a story that people are watching and monitoring very carefully here. Eric, I know you keep close tabs on the supply chain here for Apple.
Absolutely.
What have your supply chain checks shown you?
Well, definitely we saw two things that were really interesting. One, we saw units, or at least our measure of units, were much higher than I think people were expecting coming out of the new iPhone launch. And I think that really surprised people.
The iPhone 11, that is, right?
The iPhone 11, I apologize, because we were really looking at very near-term type of things. And secondly, which is kind of interesting, is we saw that the supply chain wasn't making as much money as they used to make. So I think Apple has really crushed them down as far as margins go.
Eric, I'm curious what your thoughts are with this 5G rollout. There's a lot of talk that when that finally happens and we see a 5G iPhone, that replacement cycle might actually increase, or I guess consolidate a little bit more. That basically more people are going to start buying iPhones.
I think that's definitely right. So if you look worldwide, most of the 5G rollout is in the 3 to 4 megahertz range, gigahertz range, and that actually is something that is very affordable and it's going to roll out very quickly. In the U.S., we're not doing it quite that way. We're doing it at a much higher gigahertz, 30 gigahertz. So it's much more expensive. It's going to be much patchier, and it's not going to be as interesting here in the U.S. So in the U.S. sales, 5G isn't going to be quite as important, but in Europe, in Asia, et cetera, it's going to be very, very important and be a big driver.
Speaking of Asia, Taylor, do we know anything else right now about China and what Apple is saying about their sales there?
You know, the analyst call is expected to start in under an hour, and I imagine that would be one of the first questions that Tim Cook would need to address. I think for now, at least within some of the estimates and the forecasts, not yet folded into those numbers. And so I think that we'll wait to continue to talk about as well China when we get to the analyst call. I think I just wanted to point out one more thing here. I know that we talk about a lot about the services. I would have to point out the wearables and the accessories number as well that came in for the first quarter for them, coming in at 10 billion versus estimates of 9.5. I think AirPods were a surprise blowout in the fourth quarter. I think the company said they sold like 50 or 60 million. It was a record, and I know that those depend a lot on some of the iPhone and some of the other hardware sales. But I think AirPods here are a really big bull case for the stock as well going forward.
So I just wanted to just follow up something on China. So on the supply chain, Tim Cook is really a supply chain ninja. So he's going to be able to figure this out. He's double sourced everything. A lot of the manufacturing, it does happen in China, and China is largely in lockdown where they are. But I think that's not going to be as big of a problem. The bigger problem, I think, is going to be the growth from Chinese buyers of these phones. And normally it's a pretty decent quarter here with the Lunar New Year, and you have buying there. But so I'm worried a little bit about that going forward, but it doesn't seem like it's going to affect this next quarter.